Good morning. I was asked to do a little video on boat building, but you can't jump into boat building without some historical context. Around the age of 14 or 15, I became very involved in scuba diving with the Victorian Sub-Aqua Group. And during this period, we were trained in all sorts of work, part of which was salvaging a wreck from the River Yarra. And on Saturday Night Herald in Melbourne in 1959, on the front page, they took a photograph of myself and my friend at the age of 15. And this got us a lot of fame at school because the Herald was the biggest statewide newspaper on Saturday night. So here we have a picture working on the Yarra, a picture of the wreck that we were salvaging. I had a very nasty experience in this wreck, but luckily survived. We were working under extreme conditions at the age of 15 and 16. When I became 16 to 17, I was shipped off to the merchant service, as was my family, aware that each of us had grown up with ships, and we had assigned to, see if I can find it here, a ship called the HMAS River Burnett. The River Burnett was a general carrier. Here she is here. And I served on her as a deck apprentice. However, I soon got very bored being a deck apprentice because I wanted to be in the water rather than on the water. And I transferred from the merchant service, from the River Burnett, to HMAS Cerberus, which is a naval training station. And with the intention of becoming a diver, I did not realise just how selective they were in divers. But this was Vietnam, and they were looking for all sorts of background. So when I came up to my interview in the Navy to become a clearance diver, it was discovered that they had already investigated me through the Victorian Sub-Aqua Group and knew exactly what courses I had taken. So I was shipped off to HMAS Rushcutter to become a clearance diver. I spent a lot of time in the Navy diving, getting ready for Vietnam. Here is the HMAS Sydney with the troops going to Vietnam, and she had 17 trips to bring troops up to Vietnam and back. A different situation from the American enlistment because your time in Vietnam was limited to your sign-up. In Australia, you went with the battalion. The whole battalion would go at time and be transferred at the end of a year. So there's the Sydney, an old aircraft carrier, and I was very familiar with the Sydney because we were trained to search its bottom for mines at every opportunity. Didn't last terribly long in the Navy. I had a bad accident and was allowed to discharge and went off into seminary. But that's the background of the Navy, except for one thing. During the time in the Navy, I worked a lot, not only as a diver, but with the naval shipwright. And I became very interested in ship construction and design and maintenance. Part of our job was to swim under the frigates and clean the propellers, so I got to use the bottom of most of the Navy ships rather than the tops of the Navy ships. Clearance diving in Australia is the forerunner of what you guys would call SEALs. So I became a young SEAL diver. I think I was 17 at the time, and I lasted until I was 20. I say lasted because a lot of my friends did not last. It was a very dangerous occupation, especially during the Vietnam era. Okay, coming out of the Navy, I went to seminary and got into chaplaincy, particularly naval chaplaincy and hospital chaplaincy. I did my graduate work at Duke, where I happened to meet a young woman from Pensacola, and that was the end of that story, isn't it, really? She and I both took up scuba diving at some point in time, and we had a lot of fun scuba diving. But the other thing that we were passionate about was sailing. And one year in the 70s, we went to the Annapolis Boat Show and looked at all the wonderful sailboats and discovered that the average price of a sailboat in those days was about $150,000. And they were beautiful boats, but we could no way afford that sort of thing in our professions and careers. So we came home and decided, well, if we can't buy a finished boat, let's buy a half-finished boat. Can we buy a bare hull? And then we investigated the bare hull to be delivered to our house, and again, it was way too much money. So the big problem was, what are we going to do? We want to build a boat, and then we got trapped into a thing called Bruce Roberts. Now, Bruce Roberts is a naval architect, a wonderful guy. You in Australia would know them. Bruce has done a lot of design work, and we wrote for Bruce's Build for Less, a free book. Danger. If anything's offered to you for free, be aware that you could be in deep trouble. We sent for plans for the Mauritius 43, which is a steel hull, can be rigged as a schooner or a ketch, and the plans arrived. So we could afford the plans, but that was about it. The next stage of building a steel boat was to, where are you going to build it? Well, we were going to build it in the backyard. The trouble was the backyard had a slope to it, and we had to level out with our neighbour's equipment to build a building bed. And we laid actually heavy-duty I-beams to build a solid base to start creating the boat. Now, a lot of this, of course, required welding. And we had different ideas about welding, but the thing about we needed a constant voltage of fairly high, let me see if I can find the welding. Constant high voltage welding up to 400 amps continuous duty. Now, what was going to run on a machine like that would be a four-cylinder engine. Well, it just so happened we found a 1972 Pinto. The gearbox was blown, but the engine was perfect. And we took the Pinto and stripped it down and took the engine out and created a welder using an aircraft generator. And here we have it here. Here's the aircraft generator, and here is the construction machine we made. We made a trailer out of the parts of the car, and we hooked the generator up to the four-cylinder Pinto. And that thing would run all day. It would burn 70, 18 rods. It would burn up to quarter-inch rods. It was an amazing machine. I had a remote control for it, so no matter where I was on the building site, I could switch it on and the engine would rev up and we could weld. Although I did a lot of early welding, a lot of steel boat building requires equal welding from both sides of the hull. We were creating an upright hull, and I had a friend who had a welding machine, and he would run his machine on one side and I would run the machine on the other side. One of the funny ones about the steel, we ordered a lot of steel from Ryerson Inland Plant, and we were in Durham at the time, and all the cutting design steel was listed in the plans from Bruce Roberts, and so we just had to put in that order to the steel. Well, sure enough, there were plates of steel that were 6 feet wide and 20 feet long. Long, big, long plates and lots of bar and lots of angle and so on. Well, the tractor trailer pulled into the backyard and said, well, how are we going to get this stuff off? I didn't have a forklift, of course. So we put a chain around the load and I said, drive off. And he went up the hill and the rest of the steel just folded off the back of the truck like a spaghetti. So we now had our steel. The first part of design work, and a lot of people neglect to do this, is lofting the hull. Lofting the hull is laying out a full scale in half size framing design. And each frame was calculated to be accurate to a matter of 1/8 of an inch compared to each frame. So you're making one frame for one side and then identical for the other side. The Mauritius had 26 frames, and it was 3/8 steel by 2 inches flat with solid chine bars and longitudinals. So slowly, very slowly, what happens is you get a shell, a cage growing up. Now, Martha, if we can ask Martha to come and join us, seeing we've been to Vietnam, we've been all over.
Thanks, Vic.
Well, before we leave Vietnam, I must pay tribute to this Pony Moore. He was Chief Petty Officer Moore, who is being awarded here from the Queen to the Member of the British Empire Award, because he did something very wonderful. He not only was one of the divers who went to Lake Jindabyne and cleared the intake of the inland water for the Snowy Mountain project. He was diving at 290 feet, and he had a bottom time of 7 minutes. And then he came halfway up and got into a recompression chamber, and then they sat there for 3 hours while they cleared their blood, and then they got him out of that freezing mountain water. His pony, but that's not the only thing Pony was famous for. When the aircraft carrier Melbourne cut the destroyer Voyager in half, the forward section went straight to the bottom, taking most of the mess deck sailors with it. They had no chance at all. The after section stayed afloat, and Pony, being a diver, found it his duty to, without equipment, to swim into the wreck and find people and pull them out from air pockets. And he was awarded the award from the Queen for that gallantry. Here's Pony Moore. Okay, now, Martha and I decided to do this, and we couldn't have done it without a number of things. First of all, we have the book that is the Bible for steel boat building by Gil Klingle, a very simple, good, well-written hand. I think you can probably still get it if you need to. Boat Building with Steel by Gilbert Klingle. Okay, so we started making frames, and which one have we got, Ma? Let's see. The process of making the frame, as I said, was full size, half of a full size. So you had two halves that you joined together. Martha used a cut-off machine to cut slots in the frame for the longitudinals, and here she is with a torch here. She was a pretty good torch person. I did most of the welding, but Martha did most of the cutting. And we knew she'd arrived when she could finally drop slag down her boot and stomp without screaming and throwing the torch over her shoulder. So here she is on the cutting floor. And each year we would take a picture of their progress. And this one was, we are framed, and that's one of the last frames, with our son Jeff, myself and Martha with the finished frame. The floor of the frame went down from there, and that was the construction of each frame. So the Christmas card that year said, we are framed. So each year we'd send out a Christmas card. And here we are putting gusset into the turns of the frames and so on. Now the bottom of the keel was 1/2-inch material with a web welded all the way up. Again, that was welded straight with that machine. And she would run 70-18 rods without stopping all the way down, of course, but you never go all the way down welding boats. You stitch weld, go forward, come back, go forward, come back, equal size. And this picture is a really interesting one because we were looking at the plate for the stern, which was a slightly curved plate. Now, how do you get a plate for the stern? Well, you put a couple of cinder blocks down on the cut plate, and you get a 4x4 and put it on the joist of the house and wedge it down. And then, unfortunately, it fell off one time and the whole house went clump. But we got the curve into the plate, and then we were able to lift the plate up onto the stern of the boat and weld it in place.
Here's where we're first starting to move outside.
Yeah. Now, when we move outside, we had to join the two sides of the frame together. Right. And here's Martha lying on the steel plate, and here she is grinding and cutting that frame together. And here the frames are being stacked against the tree, and there's enough frames for the whole boat. Here is the bed that we created to build on. Now, on the bed we put cross members, and Martha made a superwoman lift up the stem. The stem was the first piece that went up in the air because each side had to be joined to it. And here's the stem being adjusted. Stem was 1/2-inch material by 6 inches, and it had to be bent on edge. Bent on edge. Can you imagine that? Well, you create a press using a Sears 20-ton press, and the press, every 6 inches and slowly the curve is developed until you get the most beautiful line and curve, and there it is here being joined to the frames. After that, we just finished the frame like a big bird cage. We were concerned to put decent engine bearers in at this stage, and we were welding and stringing the longitudinals. Here's a picture of the boat with its frame up.
Pretty much finished there with frames.
And here's the deck press that Sears makes a good 20-ton jack. It's not designed, however, to bend half-inch steel. So we kept on going back to Sears every now and again and say, can we exchange this jack? And sure enough, they would let us. So that's the deck beam being framed to a mold and so on. Okay. Moving along, we spent a lot of time in the framing. We're not going to take too much time with that because it's very complex and it's hard to understand. Okay, here's a picture of the stern of the boat and the plate being lifted up that we molded. Martha's cutting steel plate here. Now she was complaining a little bit about cutting on her knees with a torch, cutting the steel plate. So I made her a little trolley that she could lie on and then slowly move down the plate. Well, what we didn't realise, she was on slight of an angle, and what happened, Martha?
Well, just if I lifted my feet up, then I flew off the back of the piece of steel. It was a little dangerous.
But I still have actually the wheels that were created to use the torch.
Right, now did use wheels on the torch, just didn't need wheels on me. But wheels on the torch was very helpful because it kept the flame a consistent distance away. It was much easier to cut.
And she would not lose a cut. She would run that cut all the way down the plane, whereas I would be popping and making an awful mess of it. After we did the cut of the plate, we had to grind the plates out, and here we are making templates for the keel area. And there, the first thing we welded up was the keel. The keel plate was 1/4-inch material welded to the 1/2-inch shoe of the keel. And each compartment of the keel was an opportunity to load the ballast at this time. So we actually ballasted the keel before the plating was done. So the keel was the first thing made. Now the thing about the ballast was, ideally you should use lead, but lead, that 5,000 pounds of lead would have been way prohibitive. So we used steel punchings, steel cut and concrete. And each load had to be weighed for each compartment because we needed 5,000 pounds. And this series is the family, our little son Jeff and Deb, all putting punches and concrete into the box of the keel. And when each box was full, we then welded a plate over it, and that became the end of that. And here's Miss Stump looking very, very tired, and Martha looking very tired after putting 400 or 500 pounds of punchings in concrete. Okay, now we're back to plating. And it used to take us the best part of a weekend for one plate, because we had to make a template for the space of the plate exactly to the chine bar and the deck beams, and then take the template and lay it on the plate, cut it out, Martha would cut it out, and I would grind it smooth to the scribe line, and then the plate was ready. We would lift the plate up by welding little hooks to it and using cross members across the frames to pull the plate into line. Now this is such a trick that welders really need to work on, because it means a fair hull, a smooth hull. You weld a piece of 1/2-inch rod at each space between the frames and put a cross member, just a temporary cross member, over the rod and nut and washer. You would then, by turning the nut and washer, be able to move the plate in and out until you got the plate absolutely fair and smooth. And at that point, you would tack weld it. You never finish weld anything, everything's tack welded, but it's tack welded in place. Another Christmas card this time, what did it say?
So we're all decked out this year.
We're all decked out this year because the deck was finished, and here we are, Jeff serving us a glass of wine on the foredeck. More framing. Propeller shaft and propeller tube going in.
And rudder.
And rudder.
Work on our rudder.
Propeller shaft and tube were the only tube pieces I had machined out of shop. I took the design down to a friend of mine's machine shop on a Monday, and I went back on Thursday and Friday, and he was still working on it. And I said, what am I doing? He said, oh, you're paying me per hour. So it was a bit of a shock when I got the build for the propeller tube. Anyway, we welded the propeller tube in and made sure that the shaft turned freely. And here's more plate going up, and so on.
How much time did you spend aligning the propeller tube? I mean, that's the one shot. You got one shot to do that.
Would you believe, as I super welded it, it bent. The propeller tube bent. And I went back to the shop and the guy said, look, and he created a screw jack for me and said, just heat it here and use the screw jack and we'll line it up. And we lined it up until that 1.5 inch stainless shaft would travel freely. That shaft had the space at the end for a cutlass bearing, a rubber bearing that takes the inside, had a marine universal joint that would attach to the hydraulic transmission. So there was enough. The problem with engine and steel boats, if you weld the mounts straight to the hull, you get a lot of vibration. So I used rubber mounts for the heavy-duty rubber mounts for the engine, which means the engine can move a little bit. And that's why you needed the universal joint rather than direct bolt it to the propeller shaft. But it worked just fine. And here it is here. You can see the propeller tube going in. Scary when it bent like that, because I thought, well, you have to cut the whole thing out. I said, no, we'll show you how to straighten it. So steel is a very forgiving medium. more design. Now here's the engine bed going in, and you see the rudder tube right there. The engine was a big mistake. We underpowered the boat. We should have had at least a 6-cylinder Perkins instead of a 4-cylinder tractor engine from Ford. I was going for economy and saying, well, that's not going to burn much more than 3/4 of a gallon an hour, the Ford. But it lacked the drive because we were pushing 33,000 pounds of boat on a 4-cylinder tractor engine. So we were lucky to get 5-6 knots out of it under power. But that's enough. We say, we're sailors, we're going to use sails. You spend more time on the engine than you think. And she ended up using about 3/4 of a gallon an hour, so it's pretty economical engine. Big cylinders.
But if there was a really strong wind, she wouldn't move at all. One day, literally, we didn't go anywhere. We finally just pulled over and said, we'll just wait for the wind to die down, in some channel.
Sails were made by Clark Sails in Essex, Connecticut. Beautiful sails. He did a lot of handwork on them, and she was rigged as a schooner. So we drove up and got the sails. He said, I want to see the fitting that you're going to put to the top of the sail. So I had to fabricate the fitting and shipped it up to him for his approval before he'd make the sails. Because he didn't want to mess with a bunch of idiots who weren't making decent stainless fittings. Here's the last little example of some of the stainless work that we did. This is a deck plug. At various times in the deck, we would weld in a socket that you could put a plug in or screw one of these in to carry a line. And you could hook your line onto your, and that saved having a permanent thing that would catch your feet and throw you over the side. So these deck plugs were all over where we needed them by just unscrewing the plug and screwing this in. Then you had a way to put a control line or whatever. So that was fabricated on the little lathe that we had. And the ring was fabricated by bending the stainless and re-welding it. So you can see if you can find the weld on that, Martha. Pretty hard, isn't it?
It sure is.
Did a pretty nice job. So these were all fabricated. Now, let me talk a minute about stainless. We fabricated all our stainless out of stainless we got from the junkyard. I would go down to the junkyard on my lunchtime when I was in Durham with a magnet, and I was looking for type 316 stainless, nothing else. And I would find odd bits and pieces here and there, and they got used to me after a while. In fact, the old couple that owned the junkyard wanted me to take over the business. I said, no, I better not. But they would hold material out for me that they wanted me to check. Used a lot of half-inch plate, and they would save it for me at the junkyard. Sid and Vi Rancer, they were a wonderful couple that kept track of us and would help me with parts. The vessel was loaded with deck-mounted masts. Now this is important because it means there are no through-hole penetrations for masts. So the mast was carried on the deck. Now that involved a mount for the mast that was particularly strong. They calculated the load of the mast was around about 80,000 pounds by the time you put 6 or 7 3/8 stays pulling it down and so on. Not the weight of the mast, but the load. An engineer friend of mine helped me design an arch for the forward mast, and here I am fitting the forward mast arch in so you could walk underneath the mast. Now this meant if the vessel rolled and lost a mast, you wouldn't have a hole in your vessel. You'd just lose your mast. But no one was going to lose that mast. The thing would have rolled over completely because each stay had 3/8 material welded to the deck plates. Now the deck plates were very important. They were plates welded between frames to carry a chain plate, and the chain plate carried through the deck plating. So you had this enormous base, and when we lifted the vessel off the trailer into the water, they wanted to put straps underneath. Said, no, you don't need straps, just shackle straight to the chain plates. So the 4 lifts were shackled to each of the chain plate, and up she went, and of course the chain plates held perfectly because I welded them. And they dropped her in the water, unshackled the chain plates, and off they went. We didn't have to put belly ropes or anything like that on. Here we then turn to the interior, and here is Miss Deb. What is she doing there?
She's grinding something.
No, she's using a lathe. She's using a metal lathe.
Oh, okay.
A wood lathe to make. Hang on, let's show that one of Deb there.
Okay.
She looks like a pirate. That's Martha and her working on the hull underneath. Part of the issue with steel is getting the right curvature, and this is where good torch work comes into and molds. Here we have a picture of me putting one of the 4-deck hatches in, and you can see the curvatures of the hatches. Okay, here is an interior shot professionally taken of the ribs and the frame, and that's a beautiful picture of the interior ribs finished. Okay. Now let's think about all the fittings. Part of the reason we can have this boat is all the fittings were handmade. Now here's Deb on the wood lathe making knobs for the
windows.
The windows or the port lights. And over here on this side you have more of the stainless steel fittings that we had to send off to our sailmaker for his approval. Okay. Here's my friend Dean, the other welder, who would weld one side and one side. One Saturday, between the two of us, we used a whole can of rods. So we both were continuously welding on opposite sides. This is when we finally stitched the boat together and we're doing continuous. Now welding becomes very important in how you weld. You always back weld in stitches of about 6 to 8 inches. Clean it and then go on. Here is the interior arch I was talking about, and the quadrant for the steering post, and here are the loads for the main mast. Those 4 pillars go straight down onto the engine bed, and the mast then sits on top of it in the cockpit. So that's tremendous load being transferred to the lower. Now we go into the interior, and most of the interior was framed up with angle in different ways, and then the wood was joined to the angle. Now what is that one, Ma? Okay.
It's a windlass there.
Yeah. My father won a little money in a lottery in Australia, and he decided to send it over to us. And what did we do with it? We wasted it. We bought an anchor windlass. So we just figured that's his tribute to us, to put the anchor windlass, and that's being installed on the bow. Okay, more panels and design work for the interior. Here, framing going into the interior.
Inside framing.
The inside framing. Now, do not believe this picture. She did not work under that duress. But here she took it as acting like I'm beating her up as a slave or something.
Felt like it.
Now we've come to the point of cutting the holes for the windows, the port lights. We fabricated the port lights ourselves out of bending material, and the big issue was there were 4 port lights across the front. Who was going to cut them out? Now we just have a perfectly smooth hole. Now you're going to cut it, and then Martha and Deb spent most of the day doing the math on where the cutouts were going to take place. And they were arguing backwards and forwards to get equidistance across the front of the cabin. And so here we are installing the frames that Martha had cut out. Here's a picture of Martha cutting one of the side ports out.
So I just want to say that Dee trusted us. In fact, he would just say, "This is your job." He didn't feel like he had to do everything. But when he turned to you and said, "This is your job," our heart is basically in our throat, because we had spent, 3 years making sure there was not a hole, not a crack, anything in this beautiful hole, and now we had to cut holes in it. So we were somewhat traumatized, weren't we,
Very
Deb?
traumatized.
And we probably remeasured until finally he said, "Just cut them!" And they turned out great.
Okay. Let's see where we are now.
Putting some side windows in there.
Side windows, yeah, they're the 4. They look pretty even, don't they?
They
Yeah.
do. Look at
Yeah,
those
there's
4
some-
windows.
4 windows.
Obviously important. Okay. I
There's
think
using the
it's
metal.
end of the
Now we go to the second volume.
Thanks.
The second series of pictures is the interior. And at this point, Martha is writing articles, and she's actually making some money from writing articles. And this lamp sitting on the table was purchased from the first article that Martha sold to Cruising World. And we have the article in Cruising World that she wrote, and she's got lots of articles here that she'll talk about in a little bit. And here's Martha looking out one of the portholes. Now, getting ready for our bunk back in the stern. Deb had her own cabin. Deb got very interested. One time, we won't go into why, but Deb got interested in building the boat with us. And she went into space and wrote on the chalk side of the inside of the thing, Deb's cabin. So she wanted her own cabin, and she got her own cabin with a folding bunk and a bookcase and drawers and everything in the end. But that was Deb's cabin. Our cabin was back in the stern, and the forward cabin was a double, and my daughter Caroline travelled with us using that forward cabin and Deb's cabin. And there's the 3 of us there and sitting in the cockpit. And what's the next one? The Inside Story. That's another Christmas story. Mm-hmm. The total was 5 years. And we used a lot of mahogany, Honduras mahogany, for hatches and doors and so on. I occasionally had to go to a conference, which was often very boring, and I would take my sketch pad and draw the next section of the boat out in terms of design. So here's a sketch from one of those conferences of a bed, a back settee, shelves and a cupboard that I did in the conference. And it turned out pretty much like that, didn't it, Ma? Yeah. Here's more of the wireless station, the interior of the galley, 2 galley sinks with salt water and fresh water, and a table here. And the pedestal, of course, was mahogany. The wheel was mahogany, actually. Now here we go, installing brackets for the self-steering gear. We had a wind vane system that had to be welded into brackets, and you can see here, Miss Stump, how cold it was during that time. And there is the bottom end of the steering gear, that once you had established it, you could take it apart. And here are the masts arriving. They are mast extrusions. They weren't tapered. They were solid shape all the way. There's the rudder going in. And here we are welding bits on the deck for lines and things. Before we paint or did anything else to the hull, everything had to be re-welded. So we could actually weld stainless to mild steel, and it did a nice job. We would then polish it.
Chip.
And chip. Now the next stage, here is the forward mast that sits over those brackets. The mast sits over the brackets, and these were to attach lines, and of course here are cleats that are welded on the deck already. So once you've got them in. Now we had to cover all that stainless steel with masking tape because we're now going to sandblast. And here I am with 2 rental sandblasts. We used something like 8 ton of sand to blast that boat. And we only could blast about 8 to 10 square feet at a time before the material and the moisture in the air would go off. When I say go off, it had to be that clean before we sprayed it with zinc for the galvanizing to take it. Any moisture would ruin the galvanizing. So we'd had 2 teams. And you can see here all the oxygen tanks and acetylene tanks that ran the gas welder. And so we're having the blasting team and the zinking team. And we had to be able to quickly switch from the compressors because we needed the compressors.
Plus it would start to oxidize that fast. So once you got the steel clean, you needed to cover it fast.
But we would run through those oxygen cylinders in a flash because the gun...
So you galvanized the outside of the boat?
The whole boat was all galvanized.
Inside and outside?
No, just inside. Here's a picture here that's a good one of putting on the spraying zinc. It's pretty nasty stuff because the fumes of the zinc will get to you. And so we realized the first couple of nights we were all sick and drinking milk to cope with zinc poisoning. We had to do something different. And here she is being blasted here. Interesting shots of being blasted. We realized that the zinc person who was spraying the zinc had to be better protected. So we had an exterior air supplied helmet that we pumped in air to him to surround him with fresh air rather than getting chances with the zinc. And here's a picture of the helmet with the zinking process going on. We used 400 pounds of zinc wire on that boat. So 400 pounds of zinc, and the big rolls of zinc went through the gun, and as it goes through the gun, the oxyacetylene flame melts it, and then the high pressure air blows that molten zinc onto the plate. Now the Navy uses it in particular, but they are so specialised. We just happened to have a friend who had the gun and did the flame spraying.
And he was the same guy that turned the shaft.
Yeah, he was, yeah. And so the whole boat had to be zinced. And it adds 20 to 25 years to the life of a vessel by zinking a steel boat. Here's a picture of underneath, the zinking underneath. Now this is a very curious one here, because here is Miss Stump, our Debbie, sitting in a deck chair with a respirator on, feeding the line to the zinc gun. It really helped have someone feed the wire to the gun because he didn't get tangled. So here she is sitting in a deck chair, feeding the line. And here's our dog here. The dog says, "I'm out of here, I'm leaving. This is nasty." So here's a picture of a dog leaving us, zinking the boat.
So what I realized is it took us 10 full days to zinc that entire boat. 10 full days.
So the rod comes in, the acetylene melts it, and what does the pattern look like? Is it like
It's like a spray gun.
Wow.
About 6 inches away.
And how thick is the zinc coating?
Goes on like paint, really.
Goes on like paint.
Yeah.
It's etched into the metal because the metal's just been sandblasted. So you're spraying molten zinc.
Yeah.
So instead of dipping it, which is galvanizing, we were spraying it.
Yeah.
And
That's amazing.
It's-
I've never heard of that.
well, the Navy uses it on highly specialized areas because it's so expensive to use.
No.
It's in the book, all in the book.
Steel book.
And here they are working on the whole cleaning. Now the problem was, once you got all that sand up in the cockpits and things, it all had to be shoveled out before you could zinc it. And so you had to work very quickly to get the sand out. Lots of pictures about zinking.
Different friends.
There's a good picture of zinc being sprayed on here by Chester. You can see the spray in the pattern.
And there's the gun and
the turbine.
Yeah.
The compressed air actually not only blew the zinc, it ran a turbine that pulled the zinc wire through. So that's why Deb had to, or other people had to feed the zinc carefully to him to allow the turbine in the gun to pull the wire in. And it pulled it just the right time to melt it to spray. So it was all designed to work together. And here are the ladies, Deb and Martha and Deb, zinking days.
sand.
And there's a
everywhere.
picture of the half the vessel zinked.
Mm-hmm.
Then, of course, comes the time of painting, and on top of that zinc galvanized hull, we had to put an acidic two-part epoxy, and then she had 3 or 4 coats, and then, of course, around the waterline. Now, interior-wise, we didn't sandblast, but we put phosphoric acid on to kill the rust. Ospo, we sprayed it with Ospo, and then we poured a fish oil primer, which was a highly commercial product, over the finished Ospo surface. And here are pictures of how smoothly. Now, what are you going to attach the lining to it? Well, you had to put furring strips on the steel. So you had to drill through the furring strips through the steel. So I went through lots of drill bits to attach those furring strips. And here are the furring strips going on. And once you have the furring strips, then you can attach your various
Your cabinets and
and whatnot.
Yeah. There, well, Dee, there's a picture of your. It's pretty. Here's the wheel.
We also made the wheel, the steering wheel, with the lathe. And there's a picture here of us making the steering wheel, which is a beautiful mahogany steering wheel
You
with
turned
a bronze hub in the middle.
Beautiful.
That was kind of a labour of love and a sort of a pride. Now, okay, you've got your furring strips in, you've got your zinc done, you've got your Ospo done. What are you going to do now? Well, you're going to foam the boat. Steel boats have a horrible tendency to sweat. In other words, the condensation will form on the inside of the vessel, and then it's going to drip on everything. You live in a rainstorm. The way to get around it is to foam it. Now, you can foam exactly, and there are pictures here of what happened with the foam. It looks horrible because now you've got to cut it back to the furring strip to get access because the foam is built out. There's a picture of the arch with the foam coming down. Now, how you cut the foam back? Well, some people say use a hot knife. You put the heaviest grade disc on your grinder and just grind stuff off, which meant that stuff was all free in the air. So you've got to be careful not to breathe it. Now, the lining board on the interior of the boat was North Carolina ash. A friend of mine came up to me at a conference one day and said, "Do you need any ash?" And I said, "Yeah, I'd love some ash." He said, "Well, I've got enough ash to build a barn." I said, "You can have it. You paid me for the pine to go on the barn." So I paid him very little for this ash. We then cut the ash into strips, boards, and you'll see them here with Deb staining the boards and Martha putting them through the jointer to create the lap stake. Each of these boards had a male lap joint, and they are primed before they go in. Okay. And here's just finished, how it looks absolutely beautiful when it's finished. And each little screw hole had to be plugged in, and then the whole thing sounded down. So here's Martha or Deb plugging the little knobs. And here's the ash carrier. And here's Deb in the cabin. She finally got what she wanted.
Finally.
My
My favorite space.
more interior, a lot of interior shots and interior cabinet work. Took about 2 years, the interior.
The ceilings going.
The ceilings were panels of plywood that were primed and then covered with a vinyl
Kind of wallpaper.
heavy-duty vinyl wallpaper that was stuck on with contact cement. And these two got very good at that, and they would wrap the plywood and make the panel, and then of course there would be a joint, nice ash piece over the joint where the panels came together. So that was a lovely thing that she really looked very nice. Here's putting in sinks, Martha's mother painting. The heads, of course, had the two heads, fore and aft, and here are some gratings that we have for a wet head that we made to have your shower, and it would then go out to the drain. And the sink. The biggest problem in the bathroom was how you make curved louvers. And it's very, very interesting. Here's a picture of the bathroom with the curved louvers and the heads. These are forward cabin. Each compartment had an air hole cut in it to make sure air circulated. This bookcase was in Deb's cabin. She insisted on that. And here's a bunk there were two forward bunks in the forward section, and so on. The next section is putting the engine in, dropping the engine in, and again we use trees and come-alongs and chain hoists to lift a enormously heavy engine in and hook it up. And we got it all going. And there she is going down into the engine space on a Sunday afternoon after church. I remember that. We were praying that we wouldn't drop the engine, but we put it nicely, comfortably down on its bed. Now once we got, there's the bed that it came on, and what do you do now with the engine in? Well, you run it. We want to make sure this thing runs. So we hooked up an artificial sea that would take water to the cooling system of the engine and cranked it up. And of course she went, and there she is blowing out, sitting in the backyard with its engine running, with its artificial sea, take cooling. Because we had to fill this up, of course, because it would pump the engine out. One of the things you do not do is rub a cutlass bearing dry. See, the cutlass bearing, so when I put it in drive, it vibrated the whole boat. Well, of course, the cutlass was not being lubricated by the seawater. And so I very quickly turned it off. But I could run the engine without throwing it into forward. So here are the strips in the ceiling. See how attractive they are. Cabinet work, all the drawers had to be dropped drawers. In other words, you can't just pull the drawer out, you have to lift it and then pull it out, and that way it's not going to throw out in a seaway.
So when you're heeling over, you want your drawers to stay in. Yeah. And Dee did all of it. He did all the woodwork.
Was that in the boat design too, or did you have to?
No, just do it yourself.
Or you know, we would sail on other boats, and every time, you know, we went on a vacation, it was to sail. And then we would be seeing how they did it. Yeah.
Now, here are some of the cabinet work around the dinette area. And the floors, we used teak tile. And I want to say something about that. My daughter came over to join us on the boat, and she insisted on dressing appropriately. I suggested she wear some boat shoes. But no, she wore high heels. And high heels on a teak floor are not good. So she's just gone back to Boston. I failed to mention that to her again, because she put all the little dimple marks from high heels into the teak floors. So poor Caroline. Here's the hatchway coming down, Martha standing now. And this is a wonderful picture of Deb and Martha having happy hour in the main saloon. We haven't got the table in yet, but there's a little table there, but you can see they're obviously enjoying a libation after a hard day's work. More shots about the cabinet work, all the cabinet work being mahogany, exterior, ash on the interior. Now I'm painting, getting ready. We took a little trinker hull and made it for a tender. We finished it off. Here is the roll of wire that was used for the rigging. Mixing. Now the bottom of the boat was tugboat asphalt, petroleum finish, heavy duty petroleum finish asphalt paint. And to the boot line, and here she is all with the boot line and the boot line coming on and so on. And then the name going on, painting on.
Idée Fixe.
Idée Fixe.
Christening party.
Christening party. Had big parties all the time. Used to get a North Carolina pig and cook the pig and invite everybody over. And there she is, almost finished in the backyard. Next thing, we had to get her to the coast. Durham is a long way from the coast, so we had to organise a carrier to carry the boat to the coast. But you've got to lift the boat up to put it on the trailer. So we organised a massive hydraulic crane to come in, hook up to those 4 spots I mentioned, lift the boat up in the cradle, look it over, put it down on the trailer. The guy said, "Oh dear, I should have got double wheels for this weight," because she's 33,000. I only had single wheels on the back. And we loaded up the trailer and we drove escort behind the boat and headed off towards the coast. And here we are flying along towards the coast. The driver got faster and faster because he didn't have a license to run at night. And we had a blowout on one of the tyres. And I yelled at him over the radio to stop. And then we had to get a truck service member to come and change the tyre for us. But we got into McCotter's Marina as it was dark. The last 10 miles was completely pitch. And we unhitched the truck and went to bed in the boat because we had a ladder and she was still on a trailer, of course. So we were exhausted. We climbed into the boat. Next morning, we attached the lift to the 4 lifting points and put her in the water. Now, the responsibility of the builder is to go below and see if there are any leaks in building the boat. Here she is being lowered into the water. I went down below and I said, "Oh God." I could hear trickle, trickle, trickle. And I said, "What's happened?" And I realized I had not capped the speedometer intake tube. And so I went down in the build and there was this cute little boat taking a leak sort of thing. And I had to cap that. Once I capped that, she was fine. And we sat in the marina for 2 or 3 days. It was Christmas. And then what happened was that day we took the boat to the McCotter's Marina. Our house was broken into. They were obviously watching when we were not going to be there. And we lost a whole lot of stainless steel fittings. We lost a lathe and machinery was stolen. And we basically knew who did it. But you can't make accusations. Anyway, the lathe was stolen, but all the machine tooling for the lathe was not. It was sitting there. So I said to a certain character, "When you knocked off my lathe, you forgot the tools. I'm going to leave it on the front porch tonight." And guess what? By morning it was gone. So I should have said, "Oh, what about the stainless steel fittings too? I would like those too." But I had to go back to my friend's factory and remake a lot of that. So here we are at Christmas and McCotter's Marina. Deb had you gone back for that Christmas?
I don't think she was there then.
Had you gone back to West Virginia?
Yeah, I was in West Virginia.
Let me explain, and Deb, and there's this light, what happened the first night. When we knew that we'd been broken into, I jumped in the truck and Martha and I flew back to Durham, 3-hour trip. 3 hour?
Yeah.
About that left Deb there. So Deb was supposed to look after the boat. Well, you tell it, Deb.
Well, I was just getting my feet wet with boats, and I was there, and I stayed up all night because there was just a little bit of water in the build, and I wanted to make sure that the boat wasn't going to sink, even though we were in the bottom of the marina anyway. But I stayed up all night and watched so the bilge didn't fill up. Well, you can tell I don't know much about boats
At that point.
at that point, because when they got back, the only thing they could do is laugh at me.
And Curtis.
And it was my 30th birthday, and it was the most wonderful birthday. There was a gentleman named Curtis Fasham who brought me a extension cord because I didn't have anything for heat. And so he brought me an extension cord, and to this day, it's still my favorite birthday present ever. And may Curtis rest in peace.
Yeah.
So I learned a lot, very much.
Here's a beautiful picture of the galley with this lamp hanging and the barometer and clock there. Okay. there you have it so far. And there she is in Pensacola, no, in Marietta. You can see how the masts are the same diameter all the way up. The cross trees and the stays. And this is our Christmas period for Blessing of the Fleet in Pensacola. Now, I think perhaps what we won't leave you much more. Here's a good one of the stern. I'm going to leave you in the hands of Martha, and she can tell. You can ask her about her record of the journeys and whatnot. Before I leave, though, there's a picture of the phone. One of the things innovation in this field. This is a knife, a rigging knife, made from a power hacksaw blade. So the power hacksaw blades are extremely good material, and you can break them and cut them, but that's a rigging knife with a mahogany handle. We've had a talk about the plug, the deck plug. Here is one of the blocks that we used for the rigging with the bronze wheels that I picked up from the scrapyard. They were bronze weights actually, and I turned them on the lathe to make a curve. And the stainless steel frame goes all the way through the block, and they were used on the booms of the boat. And I kept this one. I don't know how I got away with keeping it, but I did keep this one when we sold the boat. But there, you can imagine the size of the ropes that were needed. The dock lines were 3/4 inch nylon, so there was a lot. We had 3 anchors. We will talk about that if you want to, going through hurricanes. But we felt very secure in the boat in 80 knot winds. 80 knot winds?
Yeah.
And she just sat there like a duck and rocked backwards and forwards, and we enjoyed the light show. Luckily, we had some help medically to get through the night.
Oh, calming. I add is that I was very proud that I was the only one while we were on board for a while that was making any money. No big bucks though, but I had gotten a job of writing, and I wrote articles for the Durham Morning Herald, and I would send them an article and they would divide it up. It usually was in about 3 installments, and so there's a whole series of articles that describe all the adventures and considerable misadventures that we had as sailors, but certainly we were a lot more experienced after our three-month trip down the waterway. So that's really all I wanted to add. That how much fun
I think you need to add a lot more.
Like what?
There's somewhere or another we have an article put out by Sailing World or Sailors Gazette that Martha wrote an article on the art of going aground. Because we had been aground on every bottom you can imagine. Mud, sand, rock, and so on.
Shell.
So why don't you tell the worst story, the dragon?
Okay, so as this article says, you know, first you learn just to back off. That's easy. And then you learn to be much more defensive. If the wind is blowing this way, you're going to be on this side. So that if you do go aground, you can use the wind to blow you back into the channel, not be on the wrong side of the channel and get blown further. So that was probably lesson number 2. And then maybe lesson number 3 was how to kedge off with an anchor. A little bit more work, but usually...
I had to swim the anchors out.
Yeah. And then one time we're kedging off and we put Dee out in the dinghy. So we put the...
We were having an argument. She put me in the dinghy on the end of a boom to tip a boat over. But then she slid off and she left me out in the dinghy.
So he said, you can pull me back now. And I started saying, number 1 this, and number 2 this, and number 3 this. And when I got all my promises extracted, like, you'll listen to me the next time I tell you we're going aground, right?
Yeah.
So that was fun. But the number 1, and then in mud is a whole different thing. You know, you just kind of slide in, and all of a sudden...
Any kind of hull damage? What is, I mean,
No, steel.
No,
Steel.
nothing, ever.
Not fiberglass.
zinc and everything, you know.
It makes you a little bit arrogant, like, you know, you're not going to hurt the boat anyway. But the last one was we were coming down the waterway, and we were near Melbourne, Florida. And now we're in the Indian River. Well, the Indian River is non-tidal. So our biggest trick of just going below and having a drink and waiting for the water to rise, that was our good strategy for getting off the ground. But there you couldn't. So there's a little island that has a dragon made from coquina shell. So if you lived in that area, that you would know what that was. And we were coming around this island to stay for the night in a little lagoon, and we were actually in the channel, but it was low tide. It hadn't rained for a while, and all of a sudden we bounce, and boom, our keel wedged into coquina rock. I mean, we were stuck, totally stuck. And we weren't in any big danger because we were on the, there weren't a lot of boats. I didn't think anybody was going to run us over or anything, but still, you don't want to be sitting out in a channel for the night. But I think we did have to stay the night, didn't we?
No.
No? Well, anyway, there were a bunch of clamming boats. I guess they were coming back in. It was clamming season. Little bitty boats. And this one guy said, "Hey, for $50, I'll get you off." And we were like, "You can get this boat off? You got it." Because we had tried everything. Swam down, looked at it, it was wedged. So he takes one of our lines, he's going, "Rah!" I mean, the boat was laughing. I mean, didn't move. So then Dee says, "Well, let me get you the halyard from the top of the mast," and handed him that line. So now he goes out 90 degrees. Okay, so he starts pulling on the top of the mast. Our boat starts doing this. Well, we hadn't really prepared. I could hear dishes crashing. Later I had to clean up coffee grounds that got splattered all over. But now Dee's in the engine, revving the engine. This little boat is pulling us over. Out we flew. It was incredible. So I guess the only other thing we would have done was we would have had to call a tugboat or something to get us off.
And the clammers would come by and say, "Oh, don't worry, it's going to rain in a couple of months."
So that was our kind of climax to going to Graham, and that was something we...
It was a good article, though.
Yeah, thank you, Dee. Anyway, so obviously this was an important part of our life. That's what we did 4 or 5 years. And I think Deb was one of our few friends because we didn't go out. We thought shopping was silly. If you had a pair of coveralls, that's all you really needed. And if you came to talk to us, it would be noisy. So we weren't going to stop and chat. You had to come help us. So we had 4 or 5 guys that loved to do that, and Deb was the only gal that would hang in.
Hey, my name was on the boat.
Guys would come into the yard and ask Martha a question, and Martha would give them the answer. And then they'd turn and saw me, they'd ask the same question. I'm like, well, this made Martha mad. So she flashed up a torch and said,
I'd just start working around them, and it just really irritated me.
She had a full keel, but the part of the problem with that design was that the rudder was on the end of the keel rather than on the end of the boat, which is on a separate keg. So downwind, she was very tender. Tacking upwind, she was great. But if you want to go downwind, that keel hung rudder would oversteer it all the time. So what you would have to do is lock it down, and use the self-steering gear, which is hanging off right at the stern, and that self-steering gear would steer the boat beautifully. In fact, we sailed it across from Tampa to Pensacola, and the self-steering gear did all the work. We barely touched the helm at all, because the self-steering gear works on the wind, you see. So if the wind is constant, then you steer relative to the wind and lock it in position, and it takes over. And we would nap in the cockpit. In fact, we were all asleep one afternoon catching the Gulf, and someone yelled out, "There's a big white boat coming straight at us." And it was the Coast Guard checking on us. So who are you? The problem was they were suspicious because our water line had gone down and they couldn't see the water line, so they thought we might be carrying a bunch of drugs. Anyway, they checked us out because we'd already been checked out by the Coast Guard further up north. And we all went back to sleep, you know. There's nothing going on, the boat's steering itself. Design-wise, I probably wouldn't go with a schooner again. I probably would go to a ketch. The schooner's okay, but it didn't seem quite the right thing, did it?
I don't know. I loved it, but
Yeah. We had a real assortment of sails. We had one called a gollywobbler, which was almost half the size of the boat, very light material, just right for crossing the Gulf because very light breeze. She would gently pull her along. And what else?
I think the tracking was downwind was really our only big objection.
Yeah. And the other thing is the leading edge of the keel was sharp, and it should never have been sharp. You look at these tankers and cargo ships, what do they have on the bottom of the keel?
A bulbous foot.
Bulbous bow. Well, if I'd made a rounder entry point, she would have been less like a knife. You take a knife in a bucket of water, it goes like this. Whereas if it's round, well,
Smoother, yeah.
part of our preparation was we went to the Navy ROTC Navigation School, Celestial Navigation in Chapel Hill, which was just south of Durham. And Ed Giles, the petty officer who taught the class, helped us make sun lines, learn how to use a sextant, learn how to use the tables and whatnot. And he used the star finder, he said, like we were a bunch of nuclear sub-navigators. He said, now, when I give you the whistle, you've got to go up on deck and take a star sign on such and such a star and come back down. You know, because you're only on the upper deck for 5 minutes or something. So that was his goal. And we used to.
Yeah, but we mostly did sun lines. Stars, I mean, we never, I never figured out with great reliability what was what. And I told him we did a little bit with radio towers, and we occasionally
Radio beacons.
Yeah, so there's just one time when we were going across Lake Okeechobee, right as we pulled in, there's a bridge. And I think that bridge was 49 feet. And of course, if you look up when you go under a bridge, you're absolutely sure you're going to hit it. It's just the perspective. But anyway, we're all standing on the deck going like this, waiting for the little bits and pieces to come down, but we made it.
We made it. Yeah.
That's why we did it when we were young.
Yeah.